So let me share my screen. I hope you can see it, right? Okay. So I thought I'll start off, because the paper is on diffusion models, so I thought I'll start off by sort of showcasing what the sort of best diffusion models can actually do and what they've achieved. And so sort of really famous one is DALL-E 2 from OpenAI, where they sort of generated images from text description using diffusion models. It's not going to be the same diffusion model that I'll be talking about in the paper, but it's based on the same ideas. And so this is always sort of really cool when this came out. It's like you can change sort of text descriptions, and it will sort of generate loads of different samples of different images based on the text descriptions, which I always thought was sort of really cool. And I think this came out sort of pretty recently. So I think when this came out is when everyone started to like look into diffusion models a lot more. And there's also sort of Imagen, Google's sort of attempt at this. And so they also did sort of image generation from text. And they did super resolution using diffusion models. And I think it was something, yeah, so like text to image. And yeah, so this is like super interesting work from them. And then like there's other groups from Stable AI. This is pretty recent, I think. Yeah, just like a couple months ago. And again, sort of they were doing image generation from text. And then sort of I was going a little bit through the literature on diffusion models and what work has been done. And then I thought this was really cool, where you can generate objects from sort of point clouds. And so this is sort of 3D isotropic Gaussian. And so from this 3D isotropic Gaussian, you sort of generate a chair, which I thought was really cool. And it sort of uses the whole theory of diffusion models to do this. But yeah. Okay, so let me actually go to the paper. And this is like super fun to play around with. So like I'd highly recommend to like mess around with this. And I think they have yeah, they have a wait list where you can do like beta tests on their model and so on. But yeah, anyway. Okay, so this is the paper. So the paper that sort of started this whole diffusion model field, I guess, in generative modeling, is this sort of deep unsupervised learning using non-equilibrium thermodynamics. And so this is a really fundamental paper in diffusion models. And it was sort of the first one to really introduce them. But yeah, so it's very fundamental, but I think it's pretty important to get into diffusion models with this paper first. Because it sort of, it helps build a foundation on it. So this is a paper by a group at Stanford, where they sort of try to use statistical physics and sort of thermodynamics for their model, for the generative model. And so in this paper, so they developed an approach that simultaneously achieves both flexibility and tractability. And so the whole sort of, in this diffusion model is you take some sort of image or whatever data you have and you sort of destroy any structure in this data through some sort of diffusion process, and then you reverse it. And then sort of they go into sort of learning, sampling, and evaluating probabilities from this generative model. But yeah, okay, so in the introduction, so they say, okay, so probabilistic models suffer from two main things, so tractability and flexibility. So a lot of the distributions that you're going to be working with in generative models are not really tractable, unless sort of you're working with Gaussians, which are sort of super nice. And the other main thing is flexibility. So can your generative model sort of generalize to any arbitrary data? Or can it sort of generate data from sort of a big sort of distribution? And those are the sort of the two main like problems that these generative models try to solve, and sort of these are the main problems with them. And so this paper tries to address both of them, and I think they pretty much do. And they do it pretty nicely. And so then they also say, so for example, we can define models in terms of any non-negative function phi yielding a flexible distribution where sort of you have a normalization, and this sort of normalization, it's just the sum of x over x, which is of phi of x, which is intractable. So then the distribution over X is also going to be intractable. But they show that using this diffusion model, this is actually pretty easy to do. Yeah, and so they show like variational Bayes. So this is pretty similar to autoencoding variational Bayes, the algorithm for variational autoencoders. The ideas are sort of pretty similar, and so the derivations are similar. But yeah, so that's sort of a main part. And sort of, yeah, so there are other methods that sort of try to sort of solve this tractability and flexibility problem in generative models. But yeah, so in the diffusion probabilistic model, so that's what they call the model that they present here. So they define a probabilistic model that allows them to sort of have extreme flexibility model structure, right? They can generalize a lot of different data distributions. So you do exact sampling, which I think will make sense once we go into the actual model a bit later. And wait, so I did some stuff there. And okay, so easy multiplication with other distributions, and you can compute the model likelihood and the probability of individual states cheaply. Okay, so I think, so I put this sort of diagram here as well to show where diffusion models have been used. So in sort of application-wise of diffusion models, in computer vision, you can do image generation, so super resolution, point cloud generation, which is what I showed with the 3D models, video generation, and in text, sort of free text generation, also generation with signals, drug generation, molecule, time series. So yeah, so there's loads of different applications for this. And the main competitors with the diffusion models are sort of the VAEs, the general adversarial networks, normalizing flows, and sort of autoregressive models. So yeah, so there's a huge field of application for these sort of models, which make them sort of really interesting. They're able to sort of work with so much different types of data. But yeah, so before we get into the actual model, so I thought it would be good to have maybe a little bit of refresher into variational autoencoders. So with the variational autoencoder, you have your data X and some latent Z. And so you're trying to encode the information from X into some latent Z using a encoder. And then you sort of try to decode this information back to X. And so the aim is to sort of have the variational posterior as close as possible to the true posterior for some data X and latent Z. Right, so you have a neural network that will sort of compress your data into lower dimensional Z, and then you'll sort of upscale it back into X and do the difference in distributions, and then you're trying to minimize that. So these are sort of variational autoencoders. And there's a generalization of variational autoencoders, which is hierarchical variational autoencoders, but specifically sort of Markov. So as in the next state is only dependent on its previous state and no other state before it. So you take your data X and you sort of encode it into some latent Z1, and then you encode that latent Z1 into another Z2 and so on until some T, which is a T is here like a layer in your network. So like how many layers you have here. And then you again have your sort of decoded part, just like in the VE. And again, so the aim here would be to match the posterior of sort of this encoder to that. Right, so you'll be trying to sort of minimize this this difference in distributions. So diffusion models are an instance of hierarchical variational autoencoders. So this is sort of the main idea of a diffusion model is you take an image X and you push it through some into some latent Z, and then again, and you keep doing that. And then you keep doing that T times until what you have left at the end is just pure Gaussian noise. And the reason why this is an instance of the hierarchical variational autoencoder is because, well, in the HVAE, the latent z's are going to be of sort of lower dimension than your x's. Whereas in the diffusion model, your x and z's are going to be of the same dimension. And the other thing is sort of the encoding process is fully defined in diffusion models, which will make sense a bit later. But yeah, so a nice example here is you go from this image of a dog, and then you keep adding sort of Gaussian noise until sort of becomes blurry and then becomes fully just full noise. But yeah, so this is what it says. So our method uses a Markov chain to gradually convert one distribution into the other. So you're converting this distribution of an image of a dog into just complete Gaussian noise. So using the idea of non-equilibrium statistical physics. So they mentioned this quasi-static idea from thermodynamics. And I guess how I understand it is, so if you imagine a box with a lot of gas inside, that's at equilibrium. So that's at an equilibrated sort of pressure. Then if you take the boundary of this box and sort of decrease the volume just a tiny amount, that it doesn't cause a big disruption such that you have sort of like an instantaneous adjustment to equilibrium. And so that's this sort of quasi-static equilibrium where you can sort of change the boundary or something, but you're still in equilibrium. So that's sort of the main idea that they use from non-equilibrium thermodynamics. And so they build a generative Markov chain, which converts a simple known distribution into a target data distribution. And so you go from, you could take your image, you convert it into a Gaussian.
Yeah.
Gaussian. Yeah.
Is that one impression I got from the model that they're using is that they kind of assume that between steps in the diffusion process, there's only very small changes.
Yes.
Is that what this quasi-static assumption?
Yeah, exactly. That's why. So like in the box example, like you decrease the volume of the box a tiny amount so that you're still in equilibrium. And here you do, it's like a tiny, you add sort of tiny Gaussian noise such that your whole model doesn't break down, so that you still get to retain some information. Because if you just add sort of like, if you go from one image and add a huge amount of noise, then sort of you haven't really learned much. Like you get rid of data or sort of like structure in your data way too quickly. So it has to be sort of really sort of small steps and a lot of these steps.
Yeah, that's where I was also struggling a bit, right? So if we have two images as input, and we at the very end in the encoding layer, essentially they are, as you said, isotropic Gaussian.
Yeah.
How can we possibly reconstruct two images from noise?
Yeah, that's a really cool part about this, I guess. And it's all to do with, I guess, the reversibility in this diffusion process, which is really nice. But yeah, so I think I have something where I'll mention about sort of some stuff about reversibility. But yeah, the whole idea is a bit crazy where you can just take noise and reconstruct something that makes sense out of it. But yeah, so rather than use this Markov chain to approximate value of the model, we explicitly define some probability model as an endpoint of the Markov chain. And so each step in the diffusion chain has an analytically evaluable probability. So the full chain can also be analytically evaluated. So that's a really powerful property, I think, because, well, the diffusion so each step, it's fully defined, right? You have some parameter and it's just a Gaussian, right? So you have the full form, so you have the analytical form. And so learning this framework involves estimating small perturbations to a diffusion process.
When you say you have the full form, is that the kernel of the diffusion that has the
yeah. And so yeah, so estimating small perturbations is more tractable than explicitly describing the full distribution with a single non-analytically normalizing potential function. So I guess the way that I understood it, this is sort of, it's much easier to work with sort of small changes to something than sort of just a big shift, like a big change in your data. Yeah, and so this method can capture data distributions of any form. I was still thinking about like what they meant by since a diffusion process exists for any smooth target distribution. I was thinking sort of what are non-smooth target distributions, but I couldn't really think of any.
Like a rectified distribution, for example, would be non-smooth, right? Or no?
Yeah, but
Or maybe not. It's just like its support ends at 0. That would be a rectified distribution.
yeah. Then yeah, I was thinking like how a diffusion process would sort of struggle for something like that. But
maybe if you were to have like I guess it would, yeah, this would, an obvious one is like regions where it's possible to have a value and regions where it's not possible to have a value in a continuous.
That's true. Yeah.
In a continuous distribution.
Yeah. Yeah, actually, yeah, that's true.
Now,
okay.
Question: is diffusion a stochastic process?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so it's sort of Brownian motion. If you sort of done that before, so it's like or like a random walk where you're at a position and then you just add some sort of normal Gaussian to sort of take you to another step in some area around you. So you just randomly move in some space.
And when you apply diffusion, right? Your general process inequality holds that your entropy always is increasing, right?
Yes.
So when they say that the reverse process is also diffusion, wouldn't then that say also that every step they increase the entropy of the solution? And how do they still come up with something that looks not like even more noise, right? Because generally it's one of these things you can't really diffuse backwards in time in regular physics, right? So when you can play a movie backward, but in reality, because it's adding sort of noise, it leads to the same state of your particles being distributed. Now it's
I guess the way that I think of it is more of sort of in a dynamical system point of view, or it's like you have a path from your data to some from your distribution to sort of an isotropic Gaussian. So you apply some sort of you applied some dynamics a long time, so to evolve that path to the isotropic Gaussian. And then because of the properties of sort of diffusion, you can retrace that path back. And sort of you learn that the path that you took in sort of space to your isotropic Gaussian. But yeah, I guess, it's pretty confusing to get your head around.
The diffusion kernel itself must then be a function of time, right? The diffusion kernel can't be static along your path.
Yeah, so you have some mean that's sort of prescribed that sort of pushes you to some sort of point in your space, which is sort of like drifts you to a certain point, which is
so it's not really then the diffusion, right? So if
it's
you
not
have like
pure diffusion. No. Yeah.
So you have like a sort of sink somewhere in your
yeah.
Then
like
then it sort of works. Then you sort of reduce entropy by doing that. It's like a fridge, right? Where no matter where you end up being cold.
Yeah, I guess that's a really important point. It's like you have your random sort of walk, but then you're also tended, like you walk randomly, but you also tend to go in some certain position into a certain direction by sort of the mean that you have. But so there is some work before that was done. So the main, I think the main competitor I would guess for these sort of networks is sort of GANs, general adversarial networks, by sort of Goodfellow, which I think he also helped with this paper. But yeah, so where they train a generative model and so on, and so they compare a lot of the results that they have here against generative adversarial networks and these mixtures of conditional Gaussians as well, which are sort of again sort of good generative models. But anyway, so I think get to the algorithm a little bit. Okay, so this is another important part. So they use something called annealed importance sampling, so which uses a Markov chain to convert one distribution to another. And so this is pretty important because sometimes you can't sort of use importance sampling because the distribution that you sort of use to predict the distribution that you want to know about can be just completely different and just useless. And so you sort of construct a Markov chain from one distribution to another, and you sort of move from one to the other in some sort of space, and then use weightings onto the sequence of the Markov chain from one distribution to another. But I don't think it's super important for this paper. It's just they use it once. And then, so they have Langevin dynamics, which is this is more evolution of distributions. And so this is where this reverse property comes into play. So this is why this whole diffusion model can work, is because you have some forward SDE. So, okay, so this is the evolution of, let's say, some variable X, and this is your drift. So mu, which drifts you to some certain area. So it could be, so if this is 0, so it will drift you to sort of mean 0. And this is your, the noise term, right? So this is your random Gaussian noise. And for this SDE, you can get an analytical form for a reverse SDE, so in reverse time. So starting from a point, so in this forward one, you sort of move along some space from this point to the other. And so you have a reverse SDE, which takes you from this point back again to the initial condition that you started in the forward SDE for, which is, I mean, it always blows my mind that you can sort of reverse some stochastic process like this, but yeah.
How do you reverse it? But when you look at the reverse process, you still add noise, right? What is the DWC in that one?
DW, that's just Brownian motion. So that's just, you can imagine that as being a normal.
Exactly, but again, in the second part, you also add noise and you still reverse it. How?
Yeah, because, yeah, so there's still stochasticity in there, but you're going along sort of this gradient, which is important here, which sort of drifts you in the right direction.
And because the sigma square essentially sort of counterbalances the update harder,
yeah,
and then you add from the from the additional noise. So essentially your gradient term wins over the noise term in the reverse.
Yeah, so this is super interesting, and there are also other machine learning models which actually use stochastic differential equations in their training and sort of exactly predict this gradient of the log of the distribution. But anyway, so those are other methods, so that they're slightly newer. But yeah, okay, so to get to the actual algorithm, so there's a forward trajectory. So you have your data distribution Q of X at 0, 0 being the initial point in your Markov chain where you have your data. So the distribution is initially converted some well-behaved distribution, which is your isotropic Gaussian, with the Markov diffusion kernel where beta is the diffusion rate. And so this diffusion rate sort of varies along your Markov chain. Okay, so this is just your normal update. So this is literally
doing rate is time invariant, isn't it? It's a constant, or no?
Here, no. It's with respect to t.
Oh yeah, I see. Yeah.
And so they say later that this can be learned, or you can set it deterministically depending on where you are in your chain. But yeah, so the forward trajectory corresponds to starting at a data distribution performing t steps of diffusion. And so you have your joint distribution, and it's just becomes a product of your posteriors there. And so for the experiments, it corresponds to either a Gaussian or a Gaussian distribution with identity covariance, because that's sort of the easiest to work with. And so the encoder at each time step is a fixed linear Gaussian model. So in a VAE, you're sort of learning the weights of your encoder network. But here you're not learning any weights. You're just sort of learning your it's fixed, right? So at each time step, you have a fixed model that you don't need to vary the parameters of the encoder. Okay, so this is the forward trajectory, and then there's sort of the reverse trajectory, where it says, okay, the general distribution will be trained to describe the same trajectory, but now in reverse. And so you start from your normal distributed isotropic Gaussian noise at X capital T, and then you go back to your data X0. And so, okay, so for both the Gaussian and so they do a binomial diffusion example. So the continuous diffusion limit the reversal diffusion process has identical functional form as the forward process. And this is what they mean by sort of this SDE problem here. So it's so identical functional form. You have your drift term and you have your sigma t for your variance. You can write both down analytically. And so since this
So a quick question, the P that is in the reverse process, is that parameterized by something? Is it also data dependent, or is it completely data independent?
It's only dependent on the data from like the previous Gaussian noise, right? So it's as in like dependent from the previous step in the Markov chain.
But it's a product of P of these transition elements, right?
Yeah.
I think that the mean and the variance of P, because it's a
They
normal
parameterize P, yeah.
Both of them are calculated using a neural network, which takes into account the previous time steps representation.
So they show it nicely at the end in the appendix. So here, so your P is going to be some mu and sigma that you calculate from your neural network, and you update the previous, you update T with those weights to give you xt minus 1.
And so it, yeah, so it doesn't know about any other outcomes. It's really just that.
Yeah, it's complete Markovian. Yeah.
So we know that at the very first reverse step, we have guaranteed Gaussian input, right? So there's nothing that can distinguish two different images.
Yeah. And
yet somehow on that very first step, it can create something in there that it makes them slightly more differentiable, right?
Yeah, it's because you assume, you want the forward and the reverse process to be as similar as possible, and so you train by reducing this the KL divergence between the two, the reverse and the forward and the reverse process. And so because in the limit they're exactly the same, and so this is why you're sort of able to go back in time.
But I still don't really understand how the same distribution can lead to in just the very first reversal step can lead to something that is not isotropic Gaussian, because somehow you must have this symmetry breaking where two different inputs must at some point create, unless there's still some slight leftover at the very end state. So it's not really isotropic, but rather there's still some small.
Well, in the limit, it is going to be completely isotropic, but I guess it depends how large you pick your capital T is.
Yeah.
But even if it is completely isotropic, you are still able to sort of go back in time, because you do learn your mu and your sigma for the reverse transition.
Arvid, I was thinking about this. I mean, maybe this is a simplistic way of looking at it. Well, it probably is. It's just there's some locality here. So if you get a sample from like the upper quadrant of a mean-centered isotropic Gaussian, it would map to a different set of images in the input space. Is that
but it's not the encoding that is, because the encoding keeps the same dimensionality as the input picture, right?
Yeah.
So you would expect after many steps that the whole picture is essentially noise, right? So
yeah.
So two pictures that look very different on the left hand side, they look identical on the right hand side, right? And because the machine only takes as input the very last image in the very first step.
Yeah.
It must mean by symmetry that the step before that must also be completely isotropic. Otherwise, because it makes use of isotropically distributed input.
Do you mean in the forward process or the reverse?
In the reverse, because if it's only a Gaussian, right? If it's a Gaussian convolution, again, process or data processing inequality means that you can't get information out of nothing, and because the neural network if I understand it correctly, the mu is a function of the input data, which is again fully isotropic. At some point, you would say that if all the input is isotropic, then of course the very first step is also isotropic. And then it's from the second step as well, because it's all Gaussians from there on. So I still fail to see where
mu is not going to be from. Okay, so in this part here, okay, so this mu is just, it is going to be, so it takes as input sort of your completely isotropic Gaussian, but also, by the way, okay, I think this should answer. Wait, if I go up, where is it? So the first step in the reverse process is here, right? So this is your completely isotropic Gaussian, and then you take your next step and you put sort of your isotropic Gaussian in, but then you have your mu and sigma that you've learned from sort of minimizing the difference in distributions between the reverse and forward process. So it doesn't really matter that much that it's sort of isotropic Gaussian, right? Because you've learned your parameters.
But the parameters are the same for all the inputs, right? So you're
no, what do you mean the same for all the inputs?
Well, the functional form for the very last step is the same for all inputs, right? Because that function only acts on x of capital T.
But mu and sigma are different in different positions in the Markov chain.
Yes, yeah, that I agree. But again, if the inputs are isotropic, the outputs also must be maybe not isotropic, but not isotropic, but indistinguishable, right? So two inputs, say two inputs at x0 that are different lead to the same x capital T, right? So we have some kind of loss there. Now, if you go x capital T to x capital T minus 1, if we have it's a Gaussian process, it only takes x capital T as input. So how can x capital T minus 1 be possibly any different between the inputs if we
well, because you modify it, you modify your x capital T to be a slightly like less isotropic Gaussian, right? Because with your mean invariance, so you keep modifying your x capital.
But the mean invariance must be the same for both, right? Because it's only a function of the last step, which is isotropic.
But does the drift depends on the pixel, right? Is that correct?
The what, sorry?
The mu depends on the pixel, right? So you get different drift for different pixel. So maybe that could be.
But that would only work if the very last step was not isotropic. If there's still some residual information about the image left in xt, then you could see how it gets essentially rebuilt each step a little bit and possibly cleaned up. But if it's truly isotropic, I don't think it symmetry would sort of break that.
Could it be that the reason maybe it works because the isotropic Gaussian is, in this case, when we're talking about images, is like a projection of the original distribution. Maybe projection is the wrong word. Anyway, it's a distribution over image space. So, and I don't think that the output of the model at the end of the diffusion process is a set of parameters for the distribution. The output is an actual sample. So, you can correct me. So, like for example, an image will be projected into the same dimensional space, but if you plot all of the images in the data set, they should create an isotropic Gaussian distribution once they've been propagated through the diffusion process. But that means that each point in the isotropic Gaussian is actually an image. It's not like a pixel or something along those lines.
So you say that x capital T is as a whole is like on some multidimensional Gaussian, but at the same time, we know from the pictures that each individual one is also very, very noisy. But so then essentially we're saying that each point, each input gets mapped to a different point at a very high dimensional Gaussian. Is that
or I would say probably a different region.
a region? Yeah, because that would make sense then, right? In that sense that then different regions of that high dimensional Gaussians could then definitely map to different places in the original picture. But
I don't see how it's weird to have sort of taken isotropic Gaussian as input and sort of varied based on some mean and variance, and to move it away from being an isotropic Gaussian.
It's moving it away from essentially creating a difference between images, right? So that apparently the two isotropic Gaussians mean something different for the different input images. Where does that difference come?
The point is that you don't have a separate isotropic Gaussian for each image. They're all like this is over the distribution is over the data set space, not
okay
pixel space.
Because it feels like when we added the noise that we essentially do create the isotropic Gaussian on the image level, but you're saying that is not strictly true. We actually do it.
Well, that's my interpretation. So I didn't write this paper, but like in the backward pass also, you're sampling from the isotropic Gaussian, and then you're doing this like reverse diffusion process. So in both cases, you're not modifying a distribution. You're modifying samples from a distribution.
So when I give say these diffusion models an input to generate me an image, what actually would happen is would I restrict myself to some region in that multidimensional Gaussian on the right hand side?
So based on the CFAR 10 generated images, I think that there is a lot of blending. And so they I don't think part of this paper that they didn't really do was
They're not here.
They're up. They're in the main part of the paper.
Okay.
Like I don't think they know which region corresponds to which class. Like if you look at the images, they look so blended. Keep going up.
Oh, they're there. Okay.
There's C is just generated images where they sampled and generated. And if you zoom in on them so you can actually see them, they are such blend, like there's definitely structure that it's picking up on, but it's not able to like add the structure together to make a realistic image.
But you're still starting from a complete, well, as close to an isotropic Gaussian for an image in 2D space as you can.
So would it be fair to say that the two images that are far away in the input space would also be in that Gaussian and in encoding space still very far away? The noise that is added can't realistically put them close together because of this very slow adiabatic updating.
I would say so, and I use like the Swiss roll example that they have above. You can see that only points that are like close to each other in the both distributions. Like if you look at the third row, you can see the vectors that are mapped like the diffusion process. And so it doesn't seem like points that are very far away, like any point can be mapped to any point from the isotropic Gaussian to the Swiss roll. Sure.
No, what I mean, say take the Swiss roll example. Take the first picture and rotate it by 90 degrees. So now we have a different input picture. If I run it through the diffusion process to the right, I still get a cloud that looks very similar than the cloud produced by the initial image, right?
But so here the Swiss roll is not an image. It's like a two-dimensional space that you're projecting onto another two-dimensional space. So the data points here are not like that. That's why if you rotated the Swiss roll, you'd have to train a new model because it's a different distribution now. Whereas when you're doing it on the image in like a data set of images, your data, you're doing it over the data space, not the image
Mhm.
space, like of each image.
I think I see what you mean. So each dot in the Swiss roll is not an image pixel, but a representation of
As an image.
an image itself.
Mhm.
That would make sense again, because then that. But that's the pictures seem to imply it otherwise, right?
Mm. Yeah, I agree that like from this thing, you could think like, well, why don't you just switch the rotate it 90 degrees and how can it express both?
Yeah, because then that makes sense if all we say is that the encodings themselves over the total ensemble are Gaussian, but that is what the normal encoders does as well, right? Or variation encoder at least.
Yeah, but I guess in this case, I mean, it's fully defined by normal Gaussian. You don't have any sort of parameters that you're learning in a neural network. In a neural network. Yeah. Okay. So that's just the learning, and so you have your sort of only have like 15 minutes, but so I'll get to the loss function. The loss function is really similar to the evidence lower bound for the variational autoencoder. So the main part is this sort of KL divergence between two Gaussians. So you have your ground truth signal, which is going to be your image that you've sort of an image in your forward Markov chain, which is going to be your ground truth, and then you sort of calculate the KL divergence between that and the image that you're sort of generating from your isotropic Gaussian. Okay, and so yeah, so you're trying to minimize this KL divergence based on some mu and sigma. And this KL divergence because it's the KL divergence between two Gaussians, so it has a functional form. It has sort of a nice analytical, you can write this analytically. And so then they say, so they turn an unsupervised learning problem into a regression problem. Where you only need to learn a mu and a sigma. Which I feel like makes this problem sort of really, really nice. You go into this sort of, I think, like a complicated unsupervised learning problem, and then you transform it into regression. But okay. And so then they talk about sort of setting the diffusion rate. So you can learn the diffusion rate, or you can sort of set it yourself. So they found out that even if you learn the diffusion rate, or if you set it with this 1 over a capital T minus T plus 1, it doesn't really change anything. And then they go into how this is useful for missing data or denoising data. And so they do this by perturbing the diffusion process. And so, okay, so computing a posterior in order to do signal denoising inference of missing values requires multiplications of some model distribution with the second distribution, which they call R. And this multiplications will produce a new distribution, P tilde. And so, yeah, so multiplying distributions is very difficult for lots of different generative models, but this one does it pretty nicely. And so because it considers this sort of multiplication as sort of a perturbation in your diffusion process, and you're able to sort of get your normalization constant, which before was sort of very intractable to sort of calculate. You're able to sort of compute this much easier compared to other generative models. Yeah, and so sort of you modify your reverse trajectory, which now starts as sort of this distribution, where this P of xt is just a normal Gaussian. And so they do so this is not too important. I don't think I have time to go through this, but yeah, so, and at the end, they say, so for a Gaussian, each diffusion step is typically a very sharp peak relative to your probability distribution that you're multiplying by. And so because of a small variance, and then you can treat this as a small perturbation. So that's basically the whole idea, right? You have your diffusion process, your reverse process, and you perturb it slightly to do sort of denoising or sort of filling in missing parts of an image.
Does it also mean that if you completely reverse an encoding, so you encode and then decode, that the decode itself is actually also a Gaussian distribution, just very, very, very highly peaked?
Yes. Yeah, and it's yeah. So it will be like tiny, small Gaussian steps.
Yeah, because the sigma, because it's of course the sigma is a function of the where in your trajectory you are. So you would expect that it sort of pulls it out. Oh, that's cool.
And yeah, and so then they say they choose this distribution R to just be a constant in this case. So we choose it just for sort of convenience. And then then they can calculate sort of the entropy of the reverse process. And so since the forward process is known, we can derive an upper and lower bounds in the conditional entropy of each step in the reverse trajectory. Which is, I guess, super useful for sort of like diagnostics and log likelihood estimation. But yeah, so that's pretty much the algorithm of diffusion models. And so they do a couple of experiments for results. So they test it on the CFAR10 dataset. They do in painting, where they take this bark image and then they take I think 100 by 100 100 by 100 by 100 pixel region. And then they sort of just make that just full isotropic Gaussian noise, and they push that through the reverse process to sort of fill that region in. Result-wise, they did on par with other generative models. So again, did a bit better. But I guess that's not really the problem, an issue here. It's just more the actual idea of what they're not trying to sort of get the best metrics for that. The papers that are getting sort of published right now or in the last couple of years, the diffusion models have, like, no other model has been able to beat them in metrics wise for image generation. So that's pretty good. Oh yeah, and like mentioned before, they do the Swiss roll problem too, where they generate the mean and sigma, and it was sort of successfully learned. And they do a binary example where they sort of generate, I think, was the image for like heartbeats. No, I can't find it now. But yeah, so they do a binary problem as well, because
Could you keep going up? It's on the same page as the CFAR data. One thing I saw that with that, and I was like, there's something fishy here for me, is that so this is heartbeat data, and the final distribution that you're diffusing to is just random independent noise on binary noise on each pixel.
Yeah.
But the first column that is mapped to is all white, which is highly improbable. So I was thinking,
I don't know why
that doesn't make sense in terms of like the mapping from the heartbeat, the structured data to the unstructured.
Okay. Yes, it's because they say for ease of visualization, that's why they put it. So all samples have been shifted so that a pulse occurs in the first column. So there's always going to be a pulse in the first column, and you're only.
But I don't understand why it maps to having a pulse in the first column. Maybe I guess
they keep that. They keep that. So they keep that there, right? They don't modify that.
When you reconstruct the last image, you probably get something that looks like the first image, but possibly shifted. And by keeping the first one, they essentially force the backwards process to always start with the period at 0, essentially.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so these are so they did the binary problem, they did the CFAR dataset, and they did image in painting, and this one was one on dead leaf images. So they tested on sort of quite a lot of different data sets, and I think that's pretty much all. And so, yeah, so to conclude, so the core of our algorithm consists of estimating the reversal of a Markov diffusion chain that maps data to a noise distribution as the number of steps is made large. And so this algorithm can fit any data distribution, and it remains tractable, and it can exactly sample. And you can exactly sample because, well, every step in your Markov chain is exactly defined by a Gaussian. Yeah, so this is all sort of well and good. And I thought of sort of maybe mentioning some drawbacks of these models before I end, so only 5 minutes left. So some drawbacks is we don't get interpretable latents. So usually with sort of these auto-encoded models, you take your distribution, you compress it to some lower dimensional latent space in the hopes of like maybe getting some information from this latent space about whatever distribution that you have. But here you can't really interpret the latent representation. It's just your image plus some Gaussian noise. The latent is also restricted to the same dimensionality as the inputs, which can be a problem, especially if you want to do sort of image compression or compression problems. And another important part is, so choosing T large enough is difficult and can get expensive, because if you don't choose your T large enough, you're not going to be at isotropic Gaussian noise at the end, right? So you need to choose it such that you do end up at isotropic Gaussian or close enough to an isotropic Gaussian distribution.
Why is that actually important? Isn't actually more the number of steps you take, like the you would think that it works better the fewer input noise you add at each step, right?
But you learn less, right? That's the idea of here is, it's like you try to do sort of tiny incremental changes so you can learn as much as you can.
Yeah, so
as you tend to an isotropic Gaussian.
Yes, but why does it matter that the last image is indeed isotropic?
If you don't have an isotropic Gaussian at the end, then your analytical computations that you did at the top aren't going to work out. They're not going to end up being as nice. So that's a problem there.
Yes, again, that brings me to my caveat at the beginning, that I don't quite understand whether it would be truly isotropic on each for each individual image. Do I get isotropic Gaussian noise out?
At the end, yeah, you get fully mean zero covariance identity.
Yeah, and that is the same for two different images, right?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, then I still don't understand how possibly we could reconstruct anything from that, even by restricting ourselves purely to Gaussians. I don't think that it almost looks like it's a very good image, like denoising, where it essentially makes use of structured information that is maybe not visible by eye, because we might be able to see that structure in this noisy grainy images, but it's still there and sort of gets amplified and put into something that looks very reasonable, because it makes use of the prior that is then being learned by the process. But I feel
maybe it would be easier if you think sort of in this sort of SDE notation. So the initial condition x tilde is going to be an isotropic Gaussian, right? So it's just going to be some isotropic Gaussian variable, and then you modify that based on your mu and your sigma that you've learned. Yes,
but mu is a function of that isotropic Gaussian, right?
Yeah, but not sigma.
But sigma is only a function of time, right? So it doesn't contain any information that possibly could help me differentiate between different like images. Yeah.
But
all of the functions that you're learning, they don't take parameters in as an input. They take samples in. So they're not like nothing's a function of the isotropic Gaussian. It's a function of a sample from the isotropic Gaussian.
Wouldn't you expect that I would have thought that the point was that the exact picture at the end is essentially Gaussian noise.
It is, yeah.
And so that means if I reverse from the very last step, if I take this SDE at the very last step, it would look the same for two different images, because
yeah, it would be the same. Yeah.
So how could they possibly, if mu is only a function of is also Markovian, how can it possibly, how can the solution of this equation possibly diverge for different outputs?
For that case, I think I'll need to sort of go into a little bit detail, but this is a gradient over the data that you have, which isn't then it's not a gradient over your isotropic Gaussian.
Okay.
So yeah, so I think it would be good if I do sort of paper in the next couple of weeks that goes into sort of this model using SDEs, and I think that might make it a little bit easier to understand.
That would probably be helpful,
yeah. But yeah, this notation was a bit annoying for me. Like it didn't explain much, but yeah, it's okay. Oh, and I guess the time's up, but one last drawback is, as humans, it's unlikely we learn by generating samples. We generate sample as random noise and then denoising, right? So it's sort of, we're trying to sort of model the way that humans learn, and I don't feel like this is the way that humans do actually learn. So, but it's a very good model though, and it works very well. So that's always good. Yeah. So yeah, so that's it. That's it for me. I hope it was useful and interesting.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
It was, and it's cool that these models are now kind of state of the art in the field. So getting to read the first paper and something that leads to something that's very widely applicable is cool.
Yeah.
Does anyone have any more questions?
So what's the ratio of number of people that use these models to people who understand them?
it's probably mass. It's like 1 million, because if these are being used anywhere in, like, I don't know, back-end processes, like on our phone or something.
I mean, John Oliver used it, right? So he's not a physicist or mathematician.
Wow.
Cool. I'm gonna stop recording.